It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. Venezuela's opposition and government supporters both took to the streets in Caracas on Thursday in a day of competing demonstrations. As of this recording, both marches proved to be massive and largely peaceful. The opposition called for the protest to put pressure on the country's National Electoral Council to organize a recall referendum against President Nicolas Maduro before the end of the year so that new presidential elections might be held. However, all indications from the Electoral Council are that the referendum will not take place until early next year, probably in February. If that happens and President Maduro is recalled, then Vice President takes over for the remainder of the term until new presidential elections can take place in 2018. Joining us now to discuss today's protests in Venezuela is Jeanette Charles. Jeanette works with Venezuela Analysis and is currently a student at the Bolivarian University of Venezuela in Caracas. I thank you so much for joining us today, Jeanette.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right, Jeanette, so let's begin with how the protests went today. In the lead up to the protest, there was a lot of speculation that opposition would try to provoke violence, and several individuals were actually arrested that had weapons and explosives, according to the government. But in the end, nothing major seemed to have happened. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, according to reports I've been following pretty closely, VTV, which is a Venezuelan state news outlet, as well as Globovisión, which is a more conservative private news network. And according to both of those channels and on-the-ground sources, today's marches have been largely peaceful. Very few incidents have been reported. I've heard of one in the state of Aragua of confrontations. But other than that, even along the border, the governor of Táchira has explicitly said that everything was carried out peacefully and with much calm.
And so tell us why then some opposition members were actually arrested prior to these demonstrations.
So John Goyachea, who is a student activist, has been significantly funded by U.S. grants, was arrested with weapons.
And how do we know they've been funded by U.S. grants?
He received a prize from the U.S. government for peace and democracy. And I forget the exact amount, but I think it's several $100,000, if I'm not mistaken. And he was arrested this week with allegedly having explosives and weapons meant to destabilize the protests this week. Also, the former mayor of San Cristobal in Táchira, Daniel Ceballos, who was under house arrest for the 2014 Guarimba protests and for aiding and abetting some of the barricades in Táchira, was removed from house arrest and put into a prison this week as well. The authorities said that they heard reports of him trying to escape or would attempt to escape this week to try and accompany and conspire with some of the more violent sectors of the opposition.
In terms of the student who is been granted an award, is that a direct grant from the U.S. government or through a foundation?
I might be mistaken, and it might be through a foundation. I know earlier this week, one of our other reporters, Rachel Boothroyd Rojas, did a special report. But definitely there's able to make the connections between the U.S. government, the foundation, and this young man.
Okay. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the opposition's main demand was that the recall referendum take place as soon as possible before the end of the year, so that if they are successful in removing President Maduro, there might be new presidential elections. Is there any chance that this massive demonstration on the part of the opposition will have any bearing on the decision of the Electoral Council?
I think one of the really important things to know, and for viewers and other folks who are interested in what's happening in Venezuela, is the National Electoral Council is actually a branch of the government. So it's part of the government. It's integrated and also has constitutional regulations that it needs to follow. While the opposition may, pour in mass or in thousands onto the streets like they did today, that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to change the timeline of the recall referendum. Unfortunately, the opposition did not turn in their paperwork and the materials within a certain timeline. Therefore, it's not possible constitutionally for the referendum to happen this year.
Now, it is a part of the government, but at the same time, it's arm's length from the government in terms of how it's governed, and it's independent of the party in power in government. At least it's constitutionally set up in that way. And are there opposition members also sitting on the National Electoral Council? Is it multi-party body?
The National Electoral Council is actually elected by the National Assembly, and so there's representative percentages based on the demographics of the National Assembly. Actually, by the end of this year, the majority, if not all of the members who are sitting on the National Electoral Council will have to transition out, and the current National Assembly is charged with assigning the new leadership. However, one of the challenges with this current National Assembly is that 3 of the Congress people have actually been charged with having bought different votes in December of last year during the elections. And so one of the challenges is that for many, the National Assembly still isn't a fully functioning or legitimate legislative body. And so it's kind of stalled in some way.
All right. And now you are at the moment in Los Angeles, but normally you're a student at the Bolivarian University in Caracas. What's the mood on the streets day to day?
Yeah, I mean, generally in Venezuela, there's definitely, tensions given the difficulties with the economic crisis. I think that's something that many people will recognize and assume. However, I think that there's definitely a lot of energy around trying to figure out solutions right now to move away from what has historically been a capitalist, oil-dependent model to an economically diverse and socialist model. And so right now we're in a stage, I think, in Venezuela where it's a critical juncture right now for not just the government, but also the people of Venezuela to make shifts, not just economically, but politically and socially. So you can kind of feel all of that, I think, all the time. It's very palpable. I think even in the years where one can say Venezuela lived a much more prosperous, rising middle class era, you could still feel, the energy around trying to renovate and move forward with the Bolivarian process. And I think right now the difficulty is how to build 21st century socialism while also coming up against a very desperate and insistent opposition that does not necessarily organize around an economic or political viable alternative, but more so around making psychological threats, or violent threats that can lead to a layer of psychological terror. I think, many times it does feel like there is this kind of looming sense that the opposition would support of, resources or allies from the right wing in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then also the US to a certain extent. And there's always a possibility for some intervention. So I think that you feel that on the street very often, whether it be because of the conversations happening at the Organization of American States or the Common Market of the South, Mercosur, you feel that on the streets in Venezuela. And people are very aware. I think Venezuela is one of the few countries in the world and in this hemisphere in particular where people are very aware on the day-to-day of what's happening, not just in their local communities, but, on regional, national, and international levels. And so you can feel it, and to many extents, you can see it in different ways.
Right. Now, from the images we see of the protest today, it looks like both sides managed to mobilize very large numbers of people. What is your sense of what's to come? Because the opposition has certainly promised to continue demonstrating against the government and the decision of the National Electoral Council.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's really difficult to hypothesize many times what can happen on the ground in Venezuela. But I do think that the opposition is trying to at least put forth this idea that they, will continue with some sort of mobilization or some sort of visible strategy, right? Whether it be through the media or whether it be through different political regional institutions, like I said, like the OAS.
Speaking of the OAS, now the OAS has always played a very important and critical role in supporting the opposition in Venezuela, as we saw prior to the last coup d'etat against President Chavez. And even in these last year, there's been, with the appointment of the new Secretary General there, There's been some very harsh statements issued about Venezuela to the surprise of some of the members of the OAS, who has actually denounced the Secretary General for his going off on a whim and not adhering to collective decisions of the OAS. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, historically, the OAS has definitely been a site where I think the U.S. government and interventionist policies have been able to fester and penetrate the region in different ways. I think now what is more of a strategy is that a lot of the Latin American conservative right wing is able to position itself and speak against Venezuela in a way that might confuse a lot of people from the outside, particularly because the last 17 years, much of Venezuela's policy and outreach has been about integration regionally. I think one of the confusing factors for a lot of people is the fact that Luis Almagro, who's the Secretary General, is from Uruguay. And historically, Uruguay in the last decade has been very close, a very, very close ally of Venezuela. And even former President Jose Pepe Mujica, came out to denounce Luis Almagro for his declarations against Venezuela, having had support Almagro in his transition into that position, and then publicly expressing his disappointment and in Luis Almagro's continuous targeting of Venezuela. Even just this week, he came out with a statement that we covered for Venezuela Analysis, denouncing what sounded more like a laundry list of the opposition's grievances, less than an actual focus on what's happening on the ground in Venezuela and real concern for human rights or real concern for constitutional legality in Venezuela. I think when we think about what's going on in Brazil, we can see a very juxtapose those two examples. You see what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening in Brazil. In Brazil, there was a parliamentary coup, and Luis Almagro has yet to release a statement that I'm aware of about what's happening in Brazil. But meanwhile, the attacks are happening over and over and over against Venezuela. And Foreign Minister Delcy Rodriguez has actually advocated in many ways against the hypocrisy and the contradictions in that regional body.
All right, Jeanette, I thank you so much for joining us today and giving us a sense of what's happening there. And we look forward to future reports from you. Good luck at school.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.